They did not break the treaty by force. They broke it the way a landlord breaks a lease he thinks the tenant cannot read, quietly, on page 11, in a clause nobody was expected to notice. The Cordovi Compact had done this 47 times before, to 47 species too young or too disorganized to prove a pattern. On the 48th attempt, they did it to Earth. The violation itself was small. A mining concession in the Veitarsu debris belt, granted to humanity for 90 years under the Compact's standard developing species accommodation terms, quietly reassigned to a Cordovi subsidiary 11 years early. The paperwork called it a boundary correction, non-punitive, no admission of prior obligation. Consul-Auditor Threl Vantik signed it himself, smiling the particular smile of a species that has never once been asked to explain itself to someone smaller. He did not know that Earth kept records. The reassignment document itself ran to 4 pages, and 3 of those pages were dedicated to explaining, in exhaustive and courteous detail, why no compensation was owed. The original 90-year lease had been granted under what the Compact termed a developing species accommodation instrument, a category of treaty that, buried in a footnote on page 11, could be unilaterally revised, in the event of resource reclassification, at the discretion of the granting authority. Nobody on Earth's original negotiating team had flagged the footnote. Nobody had needed to. In 19 years of Compact-Earth relations, the clause had never once been invoked. Vantik recorded his own explanatory statement for the file, as Compact protocol required, and it was this recording that eventually reached Osai's desk. He spoke unhurried, pleasant English, the kind that had clearly been practiced rather than translated. He apologized for any inconvenience the correction might cause. He noted that humanity's continued cooperation was, as always, appreciated by the Compact. He smiled the entire time, the specific smile of someone explaining a decision to a party he does not expect to argue back. For 9 days, nobody did. The first sign anything was wrong reached Vantik's desk 9 days later, in the form of a formal inquiry from something called the Terran Treaty Archive. He assumed it was a clerical department. It was, in fact, one woman in a converted shipping container outside Geneva, and 19 years of digitized filing that no other species in the Compact's territory had ever bothered to maintain because no other species had ever needed to. "They think we forget," said Dr. Amara Osai, not looking up from her screen, "because they forget. Every empire that's ever tried to skip a payment on us assumed we had no memory longer than a news cycle." Well, she had spent 19 years building the archive before anyone believed it mattered, cataloging every agreement humanity had signed with every visiting power, cross-referencing clause language against precedent, flagging the specific bureaucratic phrasing the Compact used whenever it intended to walk away from something. She had been laughed out of 2 funding committees for it. The mining concession breach was the 11th violation she had personally predicted, and the first one large enough that anyone above her pay grade finally returned her calls. "I want the pattern, not the incident," she told her team, the morning the concession reassignment crossed her desk. "One broken treaty is a dispute, 48 is a business model." The team she assembled had one thing in common. Each of them had been right before anyone believed them. Dr. Priya Ilangavan had spent 6 years arguing that Cordovi trade contracts contained a repeating linguistic signature, a specific legal formulation, buried in translation, that always preceded a unilateral withdrawal. 2 journals had rejected the paper as speculative. She owned the pattern now and nothing else. Elias Wren, formerly of the Terran Orbital Compliance Authority, mocked, gently and often, for insisting that inspection rights under the original accommodation treaty had never technically expired, owned the hardware. He had spent a decade cataloging exactly which Compact systems Earth had been legally permitted to inspect, and precisely how thorough those inspections had been. Rounding out the team was Master Sergeant Dara Kalu, not a soldier for this phase of the work, but the archive's liaison to orbital defense, whose only job for the next 6 days was to make sure nobody above her interrupted the archivists before they were finished. Kalu had spent 3 years arguing, against considerable resistance from her own command structure, that the archive's inspection rights catalog belonged in the same briefing room as fleet doctrine. She had been told more than once that treaty footnotes were not a defense asset. She kept the memo where she could see it. Os herself had earned her seat at this table the slow way. 19 years of unfunded archival work, 2 terminated grants, and a standing joke in 3 different ministries about the woman who filed paperwork against species that didn't answer to human courts. None of it had mattered until the morning it did. She had never once in 19 years been wrong about which clause would be invoked next. She had simply been early. The discovery loop began in a records vault, not a warship. Ilangavan found it first. She spent the better part of 2 days running the reassignment clause against every archived compact communication the Terran Treaty Archive held, 41 languages deep across 300 years of translated correspondence. And on the second night she stopped typing entirely. She sat with both hands flat on the desk, the particular stillness of someone who has just confirmed something she was afraid to be right about, and then she said very calmly, "It's not 48 treaties, it's a template." The exact clause structure, reassignment, boundary correction, non-punitive, no admission appeared, with only the names of the species changed in every prior violation on file going back 3 centuries. The wording varied by less than 4% between incidents separated by 200 years. She had the linguistic fingerprint. What she did not yet have was proof that a repeated pattern, rather than 48 unrelated disputes, constituted anything actionable under the Compact's own charter. That came from Wren 2 days later, and it came with him sitting down on the floor of the archive room because his legs had simply stopped being useful to him standing. "The inspection windows," he said, not looking up. "We were never locked out of their logistics network. Nobody ever revoked our access because nobody ever thought we'd use it. 11 years of legally sanctioned compliance inspections, dry, procedural, universally ignored by every human administration that had authorized them, had given Earth a standing, treaty-protected view into the Compact's own supply routing. Fueling schedules for the enforcement fleet, coolant maintenance intervals, the exact windows during which each enforcement-class hull ran without full redundancy. Nobody had ever bothered to revoke the clearance, because revoking it would have meant admitting on the record that a species without a single warship of comparable size was worth locking out. Wren had catalogued all of it for a decade, filed it, and been quietly ignored by 3 successive review boards who considered it busy work. The final piece came from Osai herself, and it was the quietest discovery of the 3. Cross-referencing violation dates against Compact fleet deployment logs, she found that all 47 prior breaches had occurred within the 2-week window, immediately following the injured party's formal complaint deadline. Not before, never after. The Compact wasn't improvising its betrayals. It was scheduling them around the paperwork clocks of species too slow, too disorganized, or too intimidated to file before time ran out. "They've never lost a case," she said, setting the timeline down in front of the team, "because nobody has ever finished building one before their clock ran out." She looked at the calendar pinned above her desk. Earth's own formal complaint window on the mining concession closed in 11 days. "We have 11 days to be the exception." The clock this time ran out early. 3 days after Osai told her team they had 11, a Compact enforcement cruiser entered the Veitarsu belt with a formal communication addressed not to the archive, not to any government, but to the relevant human authority, whichever that may currently be, a phrase Osai recognized instantly, because it was the exact language used against a species called the Farron 4 decades earlier, 3 months before their concession was seized outright. The message was polished, patient, and devastating in the specific way only centuries of practice can produce. It informed Earth that the boundary correction was final, that further inquiry would be considered, an escalation inconsistent with developing species protocol, and that any interference with Compact assets in the belt would be treated as a treaty violation on humanity's part, the irony apparently invisible to whoever had drafted it. Humanity had 72 hours to withdraw its inquiry and its personnel. Vantik did not send the message himself. He didn't need to. He had done this 47 times, and it had worked 47 times, and the Compact's legal division had drafted the ultimatum from a template nearly as old as the reassignment clause itself. Osai read it twice, then closed her laptop with more care than the moment strictly required. Kalu wanted to know how much time they actually had, stripped of the diplomatic padding. 72 hours to comply, Osai told her, but the real clock was shorter. The Compact cruiser would need approximately 50 hours to reach effective range of the mining platform at its current heading. Whatever Earth intended to do, it needed to be ready before the ships arrived, not before the ultimatum technically expired. 72 hours, she said, is enough. It has to be. She did not raise her voice saying it. Nobody in the room needed her to. The battle, when it came, lasted 6 minutes and 40 seconds. It began the moment the ultimatum's deadline expired, and 3 Compact vessels moved to enforce the boundary correction by physically displacing the human mining platform still operating entirely legally on its original 90-year lease. Standard Compact doctrine, broadcast dominance, wait for capitulation, escalate only if ignored. It had worked on 47 prior occasions. Nobody in Compact command had reason to expect a 48th failure. They were ignored. Wren's decade of tedious, universally mocked compliance inspections had mapped every fueling interlock and coolant junction on the Compact's standard enforcement class hull. because nobody had ever imagined a species too small to fight would bother memorizing the plumbing. Kalu's team didn't target weapons or shielding. At the moment the deadline lapsed, 3 remote maintenance packets went out simultaneously, addressed to systems Earth had never been told to stop monitoring, each one instructing a single valve on each ship's primary coolant loop to close by 4 degrees. Not shut, 4 degrees. Enough to fail thermal tolerance on the forward battery within 90 seconds, and not enough for any automated system to flag as sabotage rather than routine drift. At 140 seconds, the lead cruiser lost thermal regulation on its forward battery entirely and powered it down rather than risk detonation. At 190 seconds, the second ship's engineering crew caught the drift, manually rerouted coolant flow, and brought weapons back online in 51 seconds, a genuine, competent recovery, the one moment the compact earned rather than assumed. It cost Earth its only damaged asset of the engagement, a mining tug with a scorched starboard hull, 6 meters of superficial damage, and no casualties. The third ship broke formation at the 3-minute mark and withdrew without firing a shot. Kalu let it go. Its manifest, which Ren had pulled 2 days earlier under the same inspection rights that had made the whole engagement possible, listed nothing aboard but maintenance crew and a junior logistics officer on his first deployment. There was no theme worth serving in destroying it, and Kalu said as much on the open channel in 4 words before turning her attention back to the 2 ships still fighting. By the 4-minute mark, the lead cruiser was adrift, weapons offline, thermal systems locked out for a mandatory 40-minute cooldown, its own engineering manual required. The second ship, still combat-capable, broke off the engagement at 6 minutes and 40 seconds and opened a channel to negotiate. By then it was already too late to negotiate the battle. The battle had already been about the paperwork, and the paperwork had already won. Vantik's official response arrived 4 hours later, addressed to the Terran Treaty Archive by name for the first time in the Compact's 300-year history of dealing with Earth. Every prior communication had gone to the relevant human authority, whichever that may currently be. This one did not. It offered no apology, only a formal notice that the boundary correction would be reviewed pending clarification of inspection right scope. 4 careful words that, Illengaven pointed out within the hour, were the closest thing to an admission of liability the Compact had produced in 3 centuries of the same maneuver. His personal transmission arrived that night, sent from a private channel rather than the official diplomatic register, and it did not open the way his previous messages had. There was no smile in his voice this time. There was a silence before he spoke, a full 2 seconds of dead air, which Osai would later note was the longest pause in any recorded Compact communication she had on file, longer than any silence in 300 years of documented condescension. "I am told," he said finally, "that you have been building this for 19 years. Another pause longer than the first. "I assumed a species without our lifespan would also lack our patience. I have reviewed the archive your doctor, Illengaven, sent to my office. I did not sleep afterward, which I mention only because it has not happened to me in some considerable time." He did not elaborate on what exactly, in 19 years of patient filing, had cost him a night's sleep. Osai suspected she knew. It was the 4% variance. It was proof in his own species' handwriting that the kindness had never been real. That was, I understand now, an audacious assumption to make about people who write everything down. He did not apologize for the 47 other species. He did not have the authority, and Osai suspected he didn't have the courage. But he ended the transmission with something no Compact official had offered Earth in 300 years of quiet condescension. An offer to formally review every prior accommodation treaty currently on file, given the apparent thoroughness of the counterparty. Osai watched it twice, then opened a new folder. 47 other species, she said to Illengaven, who was already pulling up the archive's cross-reference index, and were the only one with the paperwork to make this expensive for them. By the following morning, the archive had drafted formal notice to 11 other species named in the Compact's own violation pattern, the Farron among them. 40 years too late for their own concession, but not too late, Osai suspected, to want to know exactly how it had been taken from them. She offered them the linguistic fingerprint Illengaven had spent 6 unfunded years building, free of charge, along with the timeline data that proved it. Not out of charity, though Illengaven would let people believe that if it made for a better sentence. Osai had already run the numbers on what a joint claim, filed by 12 injured parties against 3 centuries of scheduled betrayals, would be worth to a Compact now facing the possibility that its oldest and quietest trick no longer worked on anyone. It was considerably more than one mining concession in a debris belt nobody outside the archive had ever heard of. She did not go home that night. She sat in the converted shipping container outside Geneva, the same one she had worked in for 19 years while nobody returned her calls, and opened a new case file. Ren, still limping slightly from where he'd caught the edge of a console during the coolant packet's launch, brought her coffee she hadn't asked for and didn't drink. Ilangavan was already 3 languages deep into the Farron's own archived correspondence, looking for their version of the 4% variance. The mining tug's hull would need repairing. That could wait. The filing deadline could not.